for coming.
Thank you for coming. I really appreciate your interest in doing this.
I've been watching Beat the Press with my mom all weekend. I'm Charlie. I'm a co-editor-in-chief with the Bulletin on our school newspaper, The Talent. Sure.
Hello, my name is Emily. We're both seniors at The Talent, which is Sharon High School's student-run school newspaper. And we're both really excited to interview today and learn more about the future of journalism. So first, we both wanted to know more about how you got into journalism in the first place. So what initially inspired you to pursue a career in journalism?
Well, I was in the 8th grade, and I thought I was going to be an astronomer. And at a certain point, I found out that math was involved. And I like to write, I like politics, and that set me toward a path of going into journalism. So I majored in journalism at Northeastern, actually, and had a pretty long career in journalism. I was in community journalism for about 10 years at the Daily Times Chronicle in Woburn, which is still around. It's still owned by the family that founded them in 1901. And then later spent 14 years at the Boston Phoenix, which was a great weekly paper. It was part of the alternative press movement. And I was their media columnist. So after a 25-year career in newspapers, I decided that I was going to go back to Northeastern, and I've been there since 2005, but I've remained active in journalism all during that time, as Steve was saying.
Focusing on local journalism, in my town we don't have a student newspaper. Well, we don't have a town newspaper, but we have our student newspaper, The Talent. I'm wondering how you think that a student newspaper can fill the void of a local newspaper for a town, and does the choice between printing the newspaper and just publishing it digitally affect readership?
Well, I think that if you have a decent number of well-motivated students, then you can certainly add some coverage of what's going on in town to what you do in terms of covering your school. But certainly covering your school is the most important mission that you have. But there's no reason why students can't do very good coverage of local governmental meetings, events in town, things like that. In terms of print versus digital, what's nice about print is that it's easier to become known. If you are digital only, and I think digital only is absolutely fine, but you have to kind of work at getting the word out that you exist. But once you do that, and I think the best way to do that is just to collect email addresses from people wherever you run into them and send them your newsletter, then I think digital is absolutely fine, and it's certainly a lot cheaper than print.
So I think this sort of just ties into the point about like how print and digital media can be a little bit different. But what role do you think local newspapers play in increasing media literacy in towns? Do you think local newspapers being digital or in print can impact how accessible, reliable information is?
I'm sorry, what's the last part of your question?
Do you think local newspapers being digital or in print can impact how accessible, reliable information is?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there have been, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but we know that, wow, this one's really loud. We know that communities that don't have a reliable source of local news have lower voter turnout, fewer people running for office, more corruption because nobody's keeping track of what they're doing. So I think the presence of a reliable source of local news and information is absolutely vital for civic life. And unfortunately, it's just been lost in too many places.
I've found that since our town doesn't have a local news station, most of the news takes place on Facebook information portals.
Yes.
And the bulk of it happens in the comment section of these
Yes.
articles. But how do you think the ability to comment on news in general, and the New York Times has this feature, and my school newspaper has this feature, how has that affected the way that people consume journalism?
Well, I live in Medford, and we have a fairly new independent news website that is slowly getting off the ground. But for the last few years, we've been pretty much dependent on various Facebook groups that have grown up around Medford. And, it can get kind of wild and woolly at times, but the biggest problem with using social media for news is that the people who are commenting, even if they're well motivated, don't necessarily know. They're saying, what have you heard? What's going on? What should we know about this development that I hear is going to go up next to my house? Instead of questions, we need answers. And in order to have answers, you need journalism. And we've had a real lack of journalism in Medford. As I said, we do have a project that is starting to do good work, and I hope that a year from now, my answer to that will be different.
Since the past year, the Talon has tried to come out with at least one print edition per year. How would you recommend marketing local papers like ours to wider parts of the community, perhaps outside of the school?
So you say you have one print edition a year?
Last year was our first year printing the paper in a while, and this year, so we only did one to get it going, but this year we're planning to do 2 or 3.
I'm not quite sure what you ought to do, but I'm going to give away another part of my talk. Let me talk about the Bedford Citizen for a moment. The Bedford Citizen is a digital-only nonprofit. Once a year, they print a glossy magazine, and it's filled with advertising, and they send it to every house in the community. So once a year, everybody in Bedford is alerted to the existence of the Bedford Citizen. And as a result, they might say, oh, well, there's this website covering the news. I'm going to check it out and, see what it's all about. Now, I don't know if that's an idea that could be adapted to what you're doing with your high school paper or not, but it is easier to get a print product into people's hands than it is to alert them to the presence of a digital project.
Printing, we found, is very expensive.
Yes.
And also, digital is much cheaper, but in order to fund the printed paper, we need to come up with the money at first. And I've heard you say that it's a lot harder to put ads on digital newspapers, but a firewall really isn't possible for a local student newspaper. How would you suggest a digital newspaper would fundraise for their papers?
A digital newspaper fundraise? A school paper?
Yeah.
Yeah, bake sales, I guess. Most digital news organizations solicit donations, and especially for a high school project, I'm not sure that I have an awful lot of advice beyond that. I don't think you're in a position to get foundation grants or that sort of thing.
So my next question is just about how newspapers should decide how to cover certain topics. In 2016, you wrote a paper titled The Bezos Effect, which analyzed how the Washington Post has changed what it covers under the ownership of Jeff Bezos, Amazon founder. We at the Talon have to consistently evaluate how we cover topics that are relevant to individuals who have power over a paper. So what advice would you have for students when covering topics that are relevant to powerful figures in the community, like school principals or superintendents?
Well, you just have to be fair, seek the truth, tell the truth, be fearless when necessary. Not easy, but it's really as basic as that. I'm not sure what more I can say about that. It's difficult with school administrators because you have another relationship with them as well. But hopefully they're mature enough to understand that as student journalists you have a job to do. And as long as you're not going to be unfair to them, then they should give you their cooperation.
If they are pushing back on publishing an article, which has happened in the past at our school, do you suggest still publishing the article, or how would you go about navigating that?
Well, I mean, if the school paper is under the control of the school, you have a dilemma. Many college and university papers these days are independent. They're their own nonprofit organizations, and so therefore the administration really can't interfere. I'm not sure I have any advice for you, except try to reason with them and appeal to their better nature.
This question is more about just the different kinds of reporting, and how do you think a newspaper should utilize multimedia in their articles, and what should the focus of photography and video be when reporting in local newspapers?
There was a huge amount of interest in throwing video into stories about, I would say, 15 years ago. And you would see some pretty dubious videos that, some poor reporter was holding up a flip camera and waving it around, and you'd say, why would anybody want to look at this? These days, I don't think you see as many videos on news sites, but when you do, they're of much higher quality. And I think the audience appreciates that. I think that high-quality videos, high-quality photography are things that the audience has really come to expect. Of course, that's a lot easier for the New York Times or even the Boston Globe than it is for a small community newspaper or for a high school paper. But so I would say don't push it if you don't really have the capability to do it. But if you can do it even on a limited basis, I think your audience will appreciate it.
How do you think your role as a professor of journalism has changed the way you see it? How do you think your students have impacted the way you see today's media landscape?
Well, I've been teaching for 20 years, and certainly I've seen a lot of changes in journalism over the last 20 years, and I've also seen a lot of changes in what students are interested in. Given my age and my experience, I tend to be oriented not toward print, but toward writing stories and maybe a little bit of photography. And my students are very interested in data journalism, high-end video, data visualization, and these are all skills that I don't have. But I understand where they're coming from, and I don't teach the courses where they learn those skills. I teach more traditional courses like opinion journalism and ethics. But I'm always impressed with their dedication to learning these skills and going out there and finding a way to do journalism at a time when the economics of journalism are very difficult.
I think we only have time for a few more questions, but one of my last questions is, in a school newspaper setting or even in a college setting where students have a lot of work going on at the time, they don't have a lot of time to dedicate to journalism, what advice would you give to students who want to write time-sensitive articles but without the proper time to write them?
Yeah, that's a tough problem. It really is. I mean, I tell my students, they get very frustrated because they need people to get back to them so they can interview them. And then somebody gets back to them and they're in class. And what I tell them is traditionally, the reporters would get in at late morning, you know, at the crack of 10, throw out a bunch of calls, and then they could hang out in the newsroom and wait for people to call them back. So actually, I think students have it harder than professionals do in some ways, simply because they can't sit around and wait for people to call them back. I mean, I just urge them to be persistent, and I try to be a little bit understanding about what they're up to. I've had students in my class say, I'm expecting so-and-so to call me back. If they call back during class, can I run out and talk to them? I say, yes, absolutely. That's more important than whatever I'm yammering about. So, but I don't know that all of their instructors, especially their non-journalism instructors, feel the same way.
My last question is, how can schools and parents help children get into journalism, and where should kids start in interacting with journalism?
Well, they should go to Northeastern. I think that you'll find that it's a scary time to go into journalism, and yet at the same time there's a lot of good things going on as well. It's never been easy. Again, I tell my students, I know it's very hard for them. I say, it's not like it was wonderful at one time and now it's terrible. I'm saying it's hard now. It was hard when I was coming up, but not quite as hard because there were more jobs and the economy hadn't gone through all the convolutions that it has now. What should parents do? I have to say, it bothers me the amount of student debt that our students are taking on to go into a field that it frankly isn't going to pay them very much. I'm not making a very good sales pitch for going to journalism school, am I? But it's, you know, nevertheless, it's very rewarding. It's incredibly important to society. It's fun. And I continue to hope that young people and their parents will support that path.
If a student is interested in pursuing journalism as a career, what advice do you have for them?
Well, same answer, go to Northeastern. What would my advice be? I would say they should get a broad general education. I'm certainly an advocate of going to journalism school, but I think that a broad education in a variety of topics is absolutely crucial for any journalist. Get involved in doing journalism at the earliest stage that you can. Student media, internships, those sorts of things. Try to make some connections so that when it's time to graduate, you have some possibilities for a job and you're not just starting from nothing.
Okay. What gives you hope for the future of journalism?
What gives me hope? What gives me hope is that over the past few years, we've seen hundreds of startup local news organizations being launched, sometimes by people who have walked away from their legacy journalism jobs, sometimes by people who don't really have much of a background in journalism. And I think that this movement of independent local news is going to be the salvation of community journalism. So that's what gives me hope.
Okay. Well, I think that's it for our questions. So thank you for talking with us. And we're excited to hear what else you have to say.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate it. My name is Dan Kennedy. I've written several books about the future of news, and the most recent one is over there. This is not a book event, but I brought a few in case anybody was interested in purchasing one. Anyway, this talk, as you can see, is News and Democracy in a Time of Crisis. What are the challenges and what can we do? So I guess I'm gonna have to stay fairly close to this. It worked. And I'd like to begin by taking a look at whether the U.S. is a beacon of press freedom. And I think that we all have this attitude that, well, yes, of course, we're the home of the First Amendment. We're the home of freedom of the press. And in fact, Reporters Without Borders, which does an annual ranking of freedom of the press around the world, said in 2025, the U.S. was at number 57. And that was down from number 55 the year before. We come in just behind Sierra Leone. Very impressive, isn't it? Norway is number 1, and other European countries fill out the top 15. So what are the reasons for that? Well, first of all, countries that are ahead of us tend to have strong public media. We don't have particularly strong public media in this country, and I think we know it just got a lot less strong. Less corporate concentration of ownership, more trust in journalism, and fewer instances of harassment directed against journalists. When I teach my ethics class now, we spend a week talking about the harassment that journalists face, both online and in real life, which is driving out some young journalists from pursuing the field. Unfortunately, the young people who are being driven out at the highest rates are women and people of color, who are the people we most need to get involved in journalism. So that's why we're not doing quite as well as we would like. Now this brings me to the idea of positive rights and negative rights. This is an idea that I got from Victor Pickard, who is a well-known media scholar. He's been on our podcast. And what he talks about is that we have a strong tradition in this country of negative rights. Now, negative rights are not a bad thing. Negative rights are, you shall not censor. You shall not bring frivolous libel suits. You shall not go after news organizations if they criticize the government. Those are all good things, but they're negative rights in the sense of that they're all thou shalt not. We have some limited ability to shield anonymous sources as well. It's limited, but it's not entirely absent. So that's what Pickard means by negative rights, and I think it's a really interesting concept to keep in mind. Because what he means by positive rights, I'm sorry, we had to translate this to Google Slides on the fly, and it didn't make a perfect transition, but we'll get through it. Positive rights are something that we're very weak in. So what are positive rights? We have little right of access to the media. The media is basically controlled by owners, and they have the last word on what happens with their news organization. If Jeff Bezos, after 10 years of absolutely sterling ownership, decides to get out of bed one day and say, I think I'm going to start ruining the Washington Post's opinion section, he can do that because he's the owner. If CBS gets acquired by a Trump-friendly mogul who decides to put a center to right-leaning opinion journalist in charge of CBS News, he can do it. So there's very little right of access to the media. Corporate ownership and profit motives prevail at the national, state, and local levels. And here's one of my favorite statistics from Victor Pickard. And this was before funding for public media got cut. Back when public media was allegedly fat and happy, the Pentagon public relations budget was higher than the allocation for public television. I mean, it's just amazing. So, strong negative rights, weak positive rights. Picard calls for a participatory democratic media, which is mostly absent in the US. I am not totally on board with him, but I would certainly like to see it tried on a limited basis in a few places to see how it works. Unfortunately, we haven't had much luck with that. And we were hoping to write about a good example in our book, and it didn't happen. The example we wanted to write about went in a different direction, which I will explain soon. So the decline of public trust. The decline of trust, which you hear about quite a bit, is true, but it's complicated. What really is going on is that people who are Democrats or lean Democratic have maintained some trust in the media. It's been falling, but it's there. Republicans and people who lean Republican have very little trust in the media. But it also has a lot to do with the question that you ask them. What are you asking them? If you ask me, do you trust the media? I'd probably say, no, I don't trust the media. But then they'd say, well, okay, what news outlets do you use? I'd say, well, you know, I look at the New York Times, I look at the Globe, I listen to NPR. Do you trust them? I'd say, well, most of the time. Sometimes they irritate me. But I trust them most of the time. Why would I waste my time with them if I didn't? So people tend to trust the media that they use. And in the case of Republicans and people who lean Republican, that has become almost entirely right-wing partisan media, especially Fox News, anything that amplifies Donald Trump. In fact, there's been studies that show that people who are center to left avail themselves of a pretty wide range of different media sources. And people who are right-wing, especially, not just conservative, but right-wing, they're pretty much just paying attention to Fox News. So that becomes a problem in terms of how we think of trust. Also, conservatives have complained for years about so-called bias. Now we're starting to see liberals complain as well. And this is the infamous New York Times front page from 2016, just before the election, when James Comey decided to reopen the investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails at the last minute. I think, as we all know, that went absolutely nowhere, but she lost 4 or 5 points in the polls overnight, and there are many different factors you could point to that lost her the election, but this may have been the biggest one. So the complaint is that mainstream sources are under fire for normalizing Trump, which I don't think is entirely wrong, but at the same time, the Times keeps growing. Truth-oriented conservative media like the Wall Street Journal are thriving, and the Washington Post continues to be a great paper, despite Jeff Bezos' taking a wrecking ball to the opinion section. The news section, so far, he has left alone. And I only hope that continues to be the case. Surveys show that local television news is the most trusted form of media. 41% trust local TV news, whereas just 29% trust national TV news. But the problem is that you don't really get much national political news on local TV news. I think that the executives tend to see national political stories as a problem to be dealt with. They just deal with it in brief. Their goal is they don't want to offend anyone. What they really want to do is to concentrate on their mission, which, as we know, is local breaking news, some local political news, and that sort of thing. The three big cable news networks fill up their primetime hours with partisan talk, shedding considerable heat but very little light. I like to say that friends don't let friends watch cable news. And of course, we certainly could point to Fox News as being the biggest offender, but I would argue that MSNBC has the same business model. They're much more truthful than Fox News, but it's still, let's get people as upset and angry as possible so they don't change that dial. Trump has been waging war on the First Amendment for a very long time. One of the things he's done is he's filed junk lawsuits aimed at intimidating the press. Disney settled with Trump because of a minor wording error made by George Stephanopoulos. Paramount recently settled with Trump for a complete garbage lawsuit about the editing of an interview that 60 Minutes had done with Kamala Harris. Very ordinary editing. Trump argued that 60 Minutes edited the interview to make Kamala Harris seem intelligent, because of course she couldn't possibly be intelligent on her own. So Paramount settled so that they could pave the way for FCC approval of a sale to Skydance Media, and that placed CBS News in Trump-friendly hands. We're just at the very, very beginning of that. We don't really know how that's going to play out. I'm sure you've heard that Barry Weiss, the founder of the Free Press, has been put in charge of CBS News. I don't think she's quite as awful as some of her critics do. What concerns me is that she's completely unqualified. She's an opinion journalist who runs a smallish website, and now she's been put in charge of a massive international news organization. I don't see how that works. Gannett, which I have plenty of bad things to say about, nevertheless has refused to settle a lawsuit brought against the Des Moines Register over a flawed poll by the legendary pollster Ann Seltzer just before the election. I'm sure you all remember that brief shining moment the weekend before the election, when the Des Moines Register reported that Ann Seltzer has found that Harris is ahead by 6 points. And we said, my God, if she's going to win Iowa, she's going to win big. And Trump won by about the margin that you would normally expect. People make mistakes, but according to Trump, this is an actionable mistake. And Gannett, to their credit, has stood strong on that. Of course, he's defunded independent media outlets. Voice of America, established to counter Nazi propaganda during World War II, is being dismantled. Republicans in Congress eliminated all funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, $1.1 billion over the next 2 years. Now, NPR and the PBS NewsHour, which is the main news outlet for PBS, they've been affected a bit, but not nearly as much as local public media outlets. And of those outlets, it's the ones that serve low-income rural communities that are being the most harmed. And that's where people rely on public radio as a lifeline for disaster information. In farm country, they're very dependent on the weather reports they might get from public radio. They don't have much else. And so this is going to be pretty devastating. It also has kind of a boomerang effect effect on NPR itself, because NPR gets most of its money in the form of dues from the member stations that are paying to put Morning Edition and All Things Considered on every day. So this is going to be a slow rolling problem. We're really just seeing the very beginning of it. Ooh, that really didn't work out, did it? They've been silencing international students as a warning sign of what could happen to the rest of us. A few days ago, 55 university and college newspapers signed on to an amicus brief where another organization is suing the government for misusing international law to silence international students from expressing their views, which are just as much protected by the First Amendment as anything spoken by U.S. citizens. I'm pleased to say that the Huntington News, which is the independent student newspaper in Northeastern, was among those that signed. Interestingly enough, no college newspaper that is controlled by the administration, that gets money from the administration, signed on to the amicus brief. And I think maybe some of these college newspapers that still have ties to official funding need to start rethinking that. The First Amendment protects everyone, regardless of citizenship. But this is a way by Trump and his allies to send signals that we may be targeted too, which is pleasant to think about. Here's Stephen Levitsky, Lucan Way, and Daniel Ziblatt in the New York Times. They did an op-ed. Levitsky and Ziblatt wrote a wonderful book called How Democracies Die about 10 years ago. I thought it was an incredibly important book. So they say when citizens must think twice about criticizing or opposing the government because they could credibly face government retribution, they no longer live in a full democracy. America's slide into authoritarianism is reversible, but no one has ever defeated autocracy from the sidelines. So, there were reasons to be cheerful, too. There used to be this great ice cream place in West Concord called Reasons to be Cheerful, but it didn't survive COVID, unfortunately. Libel protections remain very strong. The Supreme Court ruled in Times v. Sullivan that public officials suing the press would have to prove actual malice in order to win a libel suit. Actual malice is a deliberate falsehood or reckless disregard for the truth. Now, this was aimed at depriving the racist white Southern power structure of a toxic legal weapon. And in fact, the Times v. Sullivan lawsuit was based on this full-page ad that was taken out by supporters of Dr. Martin Luther King to call attention to him being in jail and trying to raise money because they needed money. There were a few minor errors in it, and some Alabama officials, including the police commissioner, L.V. Sullivan, who's not even named in the ad, said, "My reputation has been ruined. I'll never recover from this minor mistake that doesn't amount to anything." And they won in state court. And libel had never been a federal issue. And the Supreme Court took the case and they said, well, we can't let these people destroy the civil rights movement because we refuse to get involved in libel. So they came up with the Times versus Sullivan standard. Later extended to public figures, and fortunately, despite Trump's wishes, only 2 justices, Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch, have given any indication that they would weaken the Sullivan standard. In fact, earlier this year, they had an opportunity to do just that. And the court took the case mainly for the purpose of rejecting it and kind of sending a message that as bad as we are on the Supreme Court, we're not going to do that. So that's one reason to be somewhat optimistic. Another is that censorship remains extraordinarily rare. One thing I always tell my students is that everything goes back to Richard Nixon. and anytime I have a chance to put a picture of Nixon into a presentation, I'm all for it. So in the case of Neer versus Sullivan in 1931, the Supreme Court said that there are only 3 reasons for prior restraint. That is censorship, preventing something from being published ahead of time. Serious breaches of national security, obscenity, and obscenity, as Justice Potter Stewart once said, I don't know what it is, but I know it when I see it. But obscenity is not typical pornography. It's much worse than that legally. And incitement to violence. So then we get the Pentagon Papers case, New York Times versus Sullivan, where the Nixon administration argued that continued publication of the papers by the New York Times and the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe, by the way, was exactly the sort of serious breach of national security that the Neer standard envisioned. And a very divided Supreme Court said, no, it isn't. So that was a real landmark for not having censorship. In recent years, Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, and Edward Snowden have all claimed that they should be protected by the same standard. It's very complicated. I'm not going to get into it here. But I think it's safe to say that in all 3 cases, they were grounded more in their actions than in freedom of expression. We could argue the merits of those cases. I'm probably not even as up on them as I ought to be. But it wasn't pure freedom of expression. It was their actions as well. There is some limited protection for anonymous sources and documents. At the beginning of the second Trump administration, Attorney General Pam Bondi reversed guidance that had been given by Merrick Garland, saying that the Justice Department should not force journalists to turn over their confidential sources in leak investigations. And was this good? No. But a lot of people went into a panic and said, oh my God, oh my God. In fact, at the beginning of every administration, the Attorney General gives new guidance about how to deal with leak investigations. And Republican administrations tend to be less willing to grant reporters the right to protect their sources than our Democratic administrations. At the same time, I just want to point this out, Barack Obama was obsessed with leaks to the point where several journalists faced jail. Didn't exactly happen, but they were threatened with jail when Obama was president because he was determined to get to the bottom of who was leaking information to the press. I actually once wrote a piece for the Huffington Post back when the Huffington Post was a thing. And you'd write your own headlines for the Huffington Post, and I put Obama's war on journalism. So I'm not saying that things are great, but I think we do need to have some perspective. Now, there is no constitutional right under the First Amendment for journalists to protect their confidential sources and documents. This comes from a 1972 Supreme Court ruling called Brandsburg versus Hayes. But nevertheless, the states are free to enact protections on their own. And most of these matters are state matters anyway. 49 states have some form of so-called shield protection for journalists, although Massachusetts ranks near the bottom, unfortunately. Some of you may remember that a reporter for Boston Magazine named Gretchen Voss was almost forced to turn over her confidential reporting documents following an interview she conducted with Karen Reed. You remember that? And the judge came this close, and then she said, no, I'm not going to do it. It's too harmful to freedom of the press, and I don't think we're going to get enough out of it for it to be worth taking such a drastic step. So 49 states. The students were asking me earlier what advice I would give to young journalists. Don't go to work in Wyoming. Wyoming is the only state that has no shield protection whatsoever. And unfortunately, the federal government doesn't. So in federal cases, there is no protection other than the guidance given by the Attorney General. And as I mentioned under Pam Bondi, that protection is pretty minimal. There was a very strong piece of legislation that would protect sources at the federal level called the Press Act. It passed the House unanimously in 2024. They can't even vote unanimously on when to go to lunch. But then Trump signaled that he didn't want it. He wasn't president at this point, but he signaled that he didn't want it. The Senate kept delaying it, and that's the end of that. So there you go. Now, my research area, my passion, is about the future of local news. And I believe that it's essential to reviving civic engagement and overcoming polarization. Corporate greed has led to the closure of about 3,500 local newspapers since 2005. That's about a third of the total from 20 years ago. And most of the papers that have closed have been small weeklies that did the sort of quotidian neighborhood coverage that we really need, and it's just gone in so many places. A lack of local news leads to lower political participation. Pink slime. Has any of you have heard of a Pink Slime website? Okay. It's basically, it is a site that is made to look like a local news site and is actually controlled by political interests far from the scene. That's the shorthand definition of it. Increasingly, these things are being done by AI as well. My favorite Pink Slime site, they're very sloppy. The people who do these don't really put a lot of effort into them. My favorite one is the North Boston News. Have any of you ever been to North Boston? They say it's beautiful this time of year. Yeah, they don't care. And a corruption tax. What is a corruption tax? Well, the way that works is, let's say your community needs to borrow money to build a new fire station, a new school, whatever. If your community lacks a reliable source of local news, you're going to pay, the municipality, the municipal officials are going to have to agree to paying a higher rate of interest than they would if there was reliable news in the community. I mean, it's not like the lenders are saying, well, you don't have a good newspaper, we're going to charge you more. No, but studies have shown over time that this is in effect what happens. And the only conclusion we can draw from this is that the lenders know that there isn't going to be anybody keeping an eye on how their money's being spent. And as a result, they want a little bit more protection in the form of a higher interest rate. This is a reporter for the New Haven Independent, by the way. I followed her around a few years ago. She's interviewing the head of a youth basketball program. Just thought you'd like to know that. There have been hundreds of local news projects that have been launched to fill the void. They're independent, community-based, they operate free from debt and serve the public interest. Now, many of these are one or two person operations. In most cases, they are at least theoretically for profit. In fact, they're no profit. And the ones that have more reporting capacity tend to be nonprofit because they're able to take advantage of the diverse revenue streams that are available to nonprofits and that have increasingly been not available to for-profits, mainly because of the collapse of advertising and the rise of Google and Facebook. And while I'm introducing people I've met along the way, this is a reporter for the Colorado Sun interviewing a student who was demonstrating, calling for the firing of a school committee member who had engaged in inappropriate text messages with a female student. She was a great reporter. I really liked meeting her. So I'm going to give you 3 case studies that are 3 very different approaches to doing the news. The first is the Bedford Citizen. This is not the New Bedford Light, which has gotten an enormous amount of attention, and is actually a great project, but they're a large nonprofit. The Bedford Citizen is tiny. What interested Ellen Clegg and I in looking at the Bedford Citizen is that it began as a volunteer project. I know this talk is part of the League of Women Voters. It was 3 women who were in the League of Women Voters, and they were going to all of these local meetings and writing up reports for the members, and they said, why don't we just publish this on the web? Our local chain-owned weekly is not doing a good job. We think we can do better. So they started doing this as a volunteer project. Eventually, a professional fundraiser joined their board and came up with some great ideas. They began a more aggressive attempt to get voluntary membership fees from readers. They were working with the Institute for Nonprofit News, which provides matching funds under something called the News Match program. And then, I was mentioning this earlier, they have this really cool annual glossy magazine called the Bedford Guide that is just sent to every home in Bedford, loaded with advertising. So it's a significant fundraising tool for them, but it's also a visibility tool for them because it's hard. You can't get a website into people's hands, but you can get the Bedford Guide into people's hands. And they've been going for about 12 or 13 years now. One of the things that Ellen and I like to look at is, are they able to successfully survive transitions? And they've survived several. They are now on their 3rd editor. The first editor left, the 2nd editor retired, and now they just hired a 3rd editor. And they're on their 2nd staff reporter. Unfortunately, their 1st staff reporter died on the job. They found him collapsed at a high school basketball game. I knew him. I had once taken a tour with him when I was reporting for the book. And to say this about anybody, but I think this is kind of probably the way he would have liked to go out. So that's the Bedford Citizen, which I think is terrific. Now the second one is quite different. The Provincetown Independent. They are a for-profit print newspaper with a website. Now, they're organized as a public benefit corporation. And this is a special designation under the law that says you're for-profit, but nevertheless, you have to meet certain requirements to serve the public good. And as a result, it's kind of a poison pill. You don't really have corporate chains wanting to buy a paper that's a public benefit corporation. So it works in that regard. Another thing that they do is that they have a nonprofit arm. I'm actually on the nonprofits advisory board, although they never asked me to do anything. People are able to give tax-deductible donations to the nonprofit that is used to support certain types of public interest journalism in the Independent. Coverage of development, the environment, LGBTQ issues, things like that. It also supports student reporters in the summer. And you know what they just did? This is so cool because this area is incredibly expensive, especially in the summer, right? They bought a house. And they're using it to house their summer interns, which I think is just a great idea. One thing they do that I think is very interesting is if you just want digital, if you don't want the print paper, they charge you more. You can pay more for less. And the reason they do this is they really want people to see those advertisements in the print edition. They have ads in digital, but digital ads are not really worth very much. Print ads are of some value. And of course, it's Provincetown, so they get a lot of high-quality ads. So why would anybody pay just for digital? Well, Provincetown, there's a lot of summer residents who live all around the country. And they don't really want a print newspaper showing up a week late all year. So they're happy just to get the digital, and they pay a premium to do that. And then finally, so let's go back to Victor Picard talking about we need a participatory, democratic media. There have been attempts to do this at the local level. And the way that you would do this is with what people refer to as a news co-op, kind of like a food co-op or a credit union. Now, I spent years following a project in Haverhill that was under the auspices of the Banyan Project, which was started by a long-time retired journalist named Tom Stites. And he had come up with this software that he thought was going to really facilitate the rise of news co-ops. It would be governed by people on the staff, people in the community. You might become a member of the co-op by giving money. You might become a member of the co-op by writing a neighborhood blog. And they talked about this for about 10 years. And the big mistake they made, in my opinion, is they decided they needed to raise this crazy amount of money before they launched. And I don't think people will give to that sort of thing. I think they'll give to something that they can see. And in the end, they never were able to raise the amount of money that they wanted to, so they shut down. So then, we have the Mendocino Voice in Northern California. They were started by two journalists who would quit hedge fund-owned papers in Mendocino County. And it was nominally a for-profit. Like I said, it was really a no-profit, as most of these things are. But they wanted to become a co-op. And we said, let's put them in the book. This is great. One of the things we can do is track their progress to from for-profit to cooperative ownership. So I went out to Mendo County in the first week of March 2020. We all remember what was going on then. They had a big event at a local bar on Super Tuesday. So people were watching the returns come in, and then the publisher, Kate Maxwell, was talking about, we're going to be a co-op, we're going to be owned by the community, this is going to be great. And meanwhile, the news is getting closer and closer. And by about the middle of the week, I'm telling my wife, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get home. That Thursday, I went to the very first COVID news conference in Mendo County. Bunch of people crowded into a closed room, no masks or anything. There was actually no COVID in the county at that time, but we knew it was coming. And got back to Boston just in time for the shutdown on a flight that was half empty. And fortunately, our publisher let us put everything on ice for a year. As we said to her, our editor, as we said to her, first of all, we want to visit every place that we're reporting on, and we can't. Second of all, we don't know who's going to survive this. A lot of these places might go out of business. So we waited a year and then got back to work. Unfortunately, the Mendo Voice had these public events planned. There was a lot of work that goes into setting up a co-op. And one of the two founders left because of personal reasons. And the other co-founder continued as a for-profit, starting to think about going non-profit. She ended up giving the project to a larger nonprofit, which is running the Mendo Voice now and still doing a good job as a nonprofit. And we had the, I can't remember her name, but we had the head of the larger foundation that now runs the Mendo Voice on the podcast recently. And I was asking her about the co-op model, and she said, that's a terrible idea. So they won't be going co-op. Maybe somebody else will. By the way, there's a couple of national organizations that have gone co-op. I think the Defector, many of you have heard of the Defector? Yeah, they're co-op, but they're national. Really hasn't worked at the local level.
They had the bonus of, they were originally a website devoted to journalism and sports, and then they had Big Fan. So
Yeah.
they had like backers to dig in. It's more like kind of kickstarting a website.
Yes.
And now they're independent.
Yeah, that's right. There was another one in Akron, Ohio, where the founder spent all the money and then fled the scene. That was unfortunate. It was kind of a sad story. He got all this money to go co-op, and it's not like he used it to enrich himself, but he just spent it all on operating expenses, and when the money ran out, he just left. So that didn't work out too well either. So how can we bolster local news? Is there a role for public policy? There have been various ideas. Not much has come to fruition. At the federal level, there's been talk of tax credits that would provide incentives for subscribers, advertisers, and/or publishers. The idea of tax credits for publishers, which is really a pretty good idea, is that you would give them tax credits in order to hire and retain journalists. So even if you're dealing with a bad owner, you're giving them an incentive to do the right thing. States like New York and Illinois are trying it since the federal efforts have gone nowhere. The credits would be time limited, giving publishers a window to develop a sustainable business model. There's also been talk about, pushed especially by Senator Amy Klobuchar, to require Google and Facebook to pay something for the news that they repurpose. I don't think this is a great idea. And in fact, Canada imposed a law like this, and Facebook said, okay, we'll just remove all news from Facebook. And it's actually worsened their access to news in Canada. Google is more complicated, but publishers depend on it as much as they are harmed by it. Publishers will tell you, well, Google steals our content and they should pay us for it. And you say, well, you know, there's like one line of code you can add to your website and you'll be invisible to Google. Why don't you put it in? Oh, no, we don't want to do that. We depend on Google. So it's very complicated. Plus, Google has programs like the Google News Initiative, which are not as well funded as they ought to be, but they're not nothing. And that would go away. So I don't think that's a great idea. Reforms to the public notices law. In Massachusetts, public notices, also known as legal ads, must be in print newspapers. And in too many cases now, the print newspaper has no relationship with the community. I'll go back to the Bedford Citizen as an example. The town ends up having to take out public notices in the Lowell Sun, and the Lowell Sun has virtually no presence in Lowell. There has been a local, what do they call those? It's a local law that the legislature approved, that they are able to put some of their public notices in the Bedford Citizen, but that's an exception to the law, and we really need more wide-ranging reform to that, without harming the print newspapers that are trying to do the right thing. There's the notion of direct government assistance, which I think is the most problematic, because now you're taking money from the very people you're trying to act as a watchdog over. Now the Cambridge City Council has kind of dipped its toe in the water by coming up with some money to support the Cambridge Day and other outlets. They've set up an independent board, so they've tried to insulate the journalism from any sort of interference, which I give them credit for. New Jersey, there's something called the Civic Information Consortium, which gets state money and awards that money in the form of grants to interesting local news projects, not just journalism. So for instance, one of the projects they funded was an oral history of water pollution in Newark, which is obviously a worthy project, but it's not journalism as we would normally think of it. But the problem with that too is that whenever there's a budget crisis, it's the first thing that goes. So Governor Phil Murphy, who is a Democrat, zeroed out the money for the New Jersey Civic Information Consortium. Now they were able to get most of it back, but that was kind of a near-death experience. New Jersey is also a state that provided some assistance to NJPBS, which is the PBS operation in New Jersey. And at the exact same time that Congress was zeroing out the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, New Jersey zeroed out what they were going to give to NJPBS. So NJPBS is probably going away. Now they have a very good statewide news project called NJ Spotlight News that exists as both a standalone website and as part of NJPBS. And WNET, I'm sorry, I'm alphabet soup here. WNET, which operates NJPBS, has said, we will continue with Spotlight no matter what, but it may be digital only. So it won't reach as many people as it would with a TV newscast every night. California set aside $25 million for UC Berkeley graduates to cover underserved communities for 5 years. And that seemed like a pretty good way of providing direct government assistance without interfering in how the news is being covered. And I think we're just about there, because I do want some time for questions. We haven't gotten very far in Massachusetts. I've been involved in efforts to establish a commission to study the state of local news and make some recommendations since 2018. Governor Baker signed a bill to create that commission during his last days in office. It met once, and then a second bill fell short last year. And there were separate proposals for things like tax credits and public notices reform that have not been enacted. The last time I talked to a legislator's office about a new possible bill, very nice people, he said, you do have to understand we're talking about the 2027 session. I said, oh, okay, good to know, thank you. So we haven't gotten very far in Massachusetts in terms of public support for local news. But I think that Ellen and I have a line in our book of something like, government is not coming to the rescue. Local news organizations are going to mostly have to figure this out for themselves. And if they get a little bit of help from the government, they should see that as a bonus. Report for America is a program that employs young journalists and sends them out to cover underserved parts of the country. They pay for part of the cost, and the local news outlets they go to work for pay for part of the cost. And it's a great program. This is Olivia Sun, a Report for America photographer with the Colorado Sun. And Olivia's son at the Colorado Sun, and she said to me, there was no nepotism involved. So the road ahead, my call to action, such as it is we should resist attacks against freedom of the press and freedom of speech. Get your news from outlets dedicated to the fair-minded pursuit of the truth, which after all is Walter Lippmann's original definition of objectivity. And support independent local news and become an active member of your community. And here's our project, What Works, the Future of Local News. It's part of our School of Journalism and the Center for Transformative Media. We've got a book, a podcast, a website, and in-person events and webinars for local news publishers and would-be publishers. And you can follow us on Blue Sky. And that's what I've got. Actually, I'll leave that up in case there's anything anybody wants to write down. So I guess we have some time for some questions. I'm sorry I talked so long, but I'm happy to take some. Yes?
One thing that I'm interested in is like solving the news desert problem here in Stoughton, and I guess in Sharon as well. What would you recommend?
Start a nonprofit local news organization. It's hard. It's really hard. I've been trying to foster something in Medford, where I live, for several years now, and I keep telling people, I don't want to do this myself, people. I don't have time. But we do have a fledgling for-profit project now, and I hope they continue to grow. You know, if I've seen retired journalists just do a newsletter about their community, And they're doing tremendous work doing that. So it can be pretty simple. It can also be as complicated as a larger nonprofit with a board and employees and all that, which is always to be desired, but that's a harder lift. Questions? Comments? Complaints? Yes?
How do you count it? Like, I have 7 grandkids, 18 up to 30.
Yes.
And all they do is watch these podcasts. And there are 2 of them that are into conspiracy theories like crazy.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, how do you even, like I try to say, why don't you really research and see? But I don't know what makes them believe all that nonsense. And
I don't know. It becomes kind of a closed universe. I think I'm not much of an academic. I'm still a journalist, but I think the academic term is epistemic closure. And basically, not only are you believing all the information you're getting from this, but it provides this entire belief system that gives you the ammunition to reject all outside information, even though that's what you need to be paying attention to. It's a very difficult problem. Marty Barron, the former editor of the Washington Post and the Boston Globe, has lamented many times that we are now in an era when we can't even agree on our own facts. And if we can't agree on what the facts are, then we are dealing with some real trouble. And we are dealing with some real trouble. Yes?
I have many comments. Thank you for your discussion. But one of the things I noticed in the New York Times, if you see the digital version, they seem to be presenting the reporter like reporting like a news anchor as opposed to just reading the words. And I'm like, is that like surrendering to a different level of literacy that people can't even read the article? And now the reporter has to dress up and act like a news anchor. It just doesn't seem fair to the reporter who's a writer, right? And also it makes me concerned that people can't just read and text.
Yeah, whoa. The Times is trying many different things to reach people in many different ways. Certainly, the biggest different medium that they've embraced is audio. And I certainly appreciate it because sometimes I'll be looking at the Times homepage and it says, a 25-minute read, and it's like, oh, not today. And then it'll say, or you can listen to it. And I'll say, well, I can do that while I'm doing something else. So I'll take advantage of that. I am personally not a fan of those kinds of videos because I don't want to sit there and watch it. But I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with it for people who like that. But you are putting more pressure on the reporters to work in different mediums simultaneously. But, it's hard to argue with success. The Times has something like 11 million paid subscribers right now. By far the largest number of subscribers they've ever had in their history. While everybody else is, even the Boston Globe, which is doing pretty well, they can only dream of that kind of success. Yes?
Sorry, one other thing that I've noticed a lot of the time, especially locally, is that people will get their perspectives of the story out either via posting in a Facebook group, a completely slanted version of it, or in some cases even filing a lawsuit, which I think your website actually covered. I first found out about it in April, covering. And it's unfair that they are slanting basically what facts were going on. So for us, there have been people who, on behalf of SMAC, have been putting front page ads in our local advertising weekly and completely misrepresenting the situation to make it look like they were. And just having that passively around really shifts people's baseline towards. So do you have any advice for what to do when you're already in kind of a poisoned field?
Gosh, that's really tough. I am aware that the that there's been a lot of fighting over the local access station in
There's been
Stoughton.
a lot.
I can't say that I have mastered the details. I know that there is a hearing coming up this week. At the same time, it's in court. I'm hoping that I gave, it was more than I could report on, so I handed it off to somebody yesterday. And I'm hoping that he's gonna write something. He's written about it before, so we'll see. We'll see, but it's, I don't know if
That's
it's.
a specific though, I'm thinking about in general, there are people who are already like, they believe what they read on Facebook, they believe they are in the epicenter closure. I think that's actually, I'm leaning towards print as something that can help because people will see it and it's passively there in the same way we were talking about with Robinson.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's, you just hope that in the end, the actual truth will prevail. And you're in a moment where I don't think people are able to agree on what the actual truth is. So that's a real problem.
So if anyone's interested, please contact me. I'd like to get this done.
Is there anything else? If there isn't, I think I may bring this to a close. So thank you so much.